in Canada, Victoria, British Columbia. My company is Documuse. There's a few of us here. There's me, I'm the founder and consultant, and we've got several developers as well. And Anna's here. And we specialize in websites and applications, especially in law and legal aid. So we wind up using Docassemble a lot. And what we're going to talk about today, kind of a little training course, and I'm going to be showing you everything. And I'm going to be live demoing it, so which is always fun and risky in these sessions. But is how to give Docassemble a custom look and feel. If we look at basic Docassemble, here's an example from the documentation. This is the Docassemble look, right? It's neat, but it is not branded. Now, it's fine if you're using it internally, but if it's an external audience, chances are you're going to want custom colors, custom fonts. You're probably going to want your logo. So how can you do that? And it's possible to really push what a Docassemble's look and feel. Here's an example from a startup client of ours, Write My Rights. You can see from the URL that this is Docassemble, right? But it doesn't really look like Docassemble anymore, right? We've got these big rounded buttons. We've got animations, big background images, things swoop in, buttons are rounded, and so on. So it's possible to make Docassemble look like something completely custom. But I think the most important things really for external branding are you want your font, you want your colors, you want your logo, right? That's table stakes. Let me show you how to get there. As you may or may not know, Docassemble uses Bootstrap as the UI framework. The Bootstrap predefines a whole bunch of components. This is the Bootstrap website. If we go into the examples here, you see there's the header bar that Bootstrap gives you, right? And that looks pretty familiar, doesn't it? Looks kind of like Docassemble. Or if you go into some of the form components, right? This is why Docassemble looks the way it does, because it's using Bootstrap. Now, Bootstrap uses Sass. Sass is a precompiler for CSS. So you're probably familiar with CSS, with style sheets. When you do something in Sass, like for example, change a color, then it will go through and update maybe 100 different places where that color is used in the CSS. So it's like a kind of a fast way to make lots of different changes. And the best way to modify Bootstrap is to work with the Sass. Now, if you go to Bootstrap website, you can see they've got a link to their GitHub repo. And when I click there, one of their repos is examples. In examples, here's a directory of them all. This is what I want here, this ability to import Sass. So they give some instructions on this Sass.js example. And here's what you do. You clone it, you go into that directory, you install it, and you start it on your local machine. And what that gives you, I've done this, I did it yesterday in preparation for this demo. And it gives you a little server that runs on port 3000, and I'll show you here. I got it running. Yeah, there's my local host 3000, and it gives you this. Now, if I go back to VS Code and open this, there's two key files here that you got to think about, and that's this one, styles.scss. That's the Sass file, and styles.css. This is the compiled minified CSS that you don't want to touch this, right? It's a big old mess, but it's generated from this Sass file. Now, at the top, notice I've got this body BG. If I just change this to like a hideous red, FF0000, and save it, my CSS file gets regenerated, on the fly, and then I go back and I refresh, and now it's a hideous red. Now, why this becomes really important is because when you're designing something, you need instant UI feedback, right? You don't want to work on CSS and then have to import it into Docassemble. You want to see immediately in Docassemble what the effects are of the styling changes you made. So I'm going to open Docassemble, which I have running here locally. I'm just going to, am I already signed in? Yes, I'm going to go over to my playground. And I've got a little package here, a little interview. All right, let me just save and run that, see what we're looking at here. So this is a real agreement that we built for one of our other clients, People's Law School. I'll just show you People's Law School. So we're the web developer of record for People's Law School. It's a great website, actually. They just won an award last week, Best Content Experience at the Vancouver User Experience Awards. It's a long-running UX competition in British Columbia. But anyway, you can see their logo, you can see some of the colors and fonts they use. And what we want to do is get this Docassemble interview looking like this. All right, so it doesn't look like that now. Well, first, what I'm going to do in features is I'm going to add a little reference to a style sheet. So again, basic Docassemble code, CSS styles.css. All right, so now it wants to reference a style sheet that is in my package. I'm going to go over to static files, and now I'm going to create that file. I'm going to add styles.css. And here, I'm going to put in a little bit of code. So what this says is right now it's going to import my style sheet from this location, from my local host running on 3000, CSS styles.css. And this, when we are in development mode, this is what we do. And when we go into production, what we would actually do is comment out this line and uncomment this line. Anyway, I'll get more to that later. But let me save this. All right, and then let's go back to our template agreement and refresh. And now it's a hideous red, confirming that we are bringing in that local style sheet. So now I can work with it locally. Let's first of all put that color back. I save. Notice again, it's recompiling at the bottom. I go back and refresh. Good, it's gone. So I'm going to make a few changes. So first, I want my custom fonts. So at the very top, I'm going to paste in the custom font code that Google gives you. So I'm just importing their two fonts, Montserrat and Open Sans. So that's right at the top of my SAS file. And then I'm going to bring in a few font declarations. Let's just put them in here. Fonts. So I'm using the SAS to say that my sans serif font is Open Sans, my headings are Montserrat. We put in this little contrast ratio thing because that gets the buttons looking right. I save that, and again, I go back to my Docassemble interview, I refresh, and notice what changed? Now that's Montserrat, that's Open Sans. So now I've got their fonts. So that's awesome. Next, I'm going to put in a few custom colors. So below here, I'm going to paste. So you can see here the custom colors I just put in. These are People's Law School colors, what their orange looks like, what their red looks like, what their dark blue and so on looks like. I'm going to save that, go back and refresh, and well, I barely see the difference there, but it's tiny. And now I want to put in the logo. So you can see I've got People's Law School right there at the top, but I want to show their nice little logo. I'm going to go back here in my playground. You can see under the metadata, I've got the logo showing right here in short logo. I'm just going to go ID equals logo, and H4 ID equals logo. And that gives me a little CSS hook that I can grab onto. Let me save that. And back in my file here, I'm just going to put this in at the bottom. There are some specifications for my logo that I prepared in advance. So I'm saying that I want you to take the background image from this folder. Actually, and I don't even have it there. Let me find it on my other screen here. 1 second. We want to drag a logo into my little image folder. Here it is. I am dragging it across, drop an image in. So you see what's going on there? It's referencing my logo. It's displaying it block. It's getting rid of the text, putting it way off screen. But now I save that. I go back to my interview. Let's refresh. There. Nice. I've got a logo. What else should we do? I think we want to make the nav bar, we want to turn that blue. So at the bottom, I paste in a little thing that says, make the background color of the nav bar blue. I save it and I refresh here, and now it's blue. The key is being able to iterate really quickly, and to do that, you need to be accessing your style sheet directly. Now, once I'm all done and I've got a look and feel that I like, then I go into this styles.css, this file right here, right? Can't look at it, but I do a Control-A, a Control-C. Okay, now I've copied it, and then I go over into my playground, and I'm going to go into static files, and notice how it's accessing build.css if I uncomment this. So I want to comment, I go like that, comment out that line, like so. So now, right, it's no longer accessing my local, whoops, what did I just do? Whoop. Oh, save, there we go, save, refresh. Okay, all my styles are gone. It's looking for the file build.css, so I'm going to add that. I'm going to say build.css, and I'm going to paste all of that CSS, that generated CSS, and save it. Now when I refresh, everything's back, and now everything is contained within Docassemble. I'm no longer accessing my local host. I'm ready to go to production. And just to show you how this works in real life, this is on People's Law School Live website. There's the template agreement for the sale of a used car. I click build my agreement, and there's the whole thing. Continue, first name, seller. Well, you know what? She's actually selling a car right now. Dave Robinson, also from Victoria, make and model, BMW 328, but it's not that exciting because it's 2009, right? Gray, and the vehicle of identification number, and the odometer reading was 108,000, and continue, and you know what? It's amazing what they're asking for cars these days, isn't it? The date, the payment is, it's today, delivery is today, and we go save. Any warranties? No. So there's some sample wording. Continue. Will there be inspection? No. Resolving disputes. Continue. Governing law. That's fine. British Columbia. Continue. We're generating our document. And there it is. We have a document. Nice. And there we go. Docassemble did its job, and we customized the look and feel. And I'm just going to pop back to the beginning too to show you, if you weren't there for the beginning of the session, this is how custom your look and feel can get in Docassemble, right? It can get crazy, but it's just key to be able to develop it locally. Now, I just had a few best practices for developing a Docassemble that I'll show you, that we'll discuss, or maybe tips, I guess, design tips. The first is, don't use Docassemble features just because they're there, right? Docassemble does so much, and it's got so many different widgets that you can use, and there's a temptation to like try it out and put it in. But what happens is you get some really messy looking interviews, and I've seen a lot of them. I'm going to show you one I just found from the web. Hope somebody in this room didn't develop it. If so, I'm sorry, because I'm picking on it, right? But this is one for the state of Massachusetts, and this screen is daunting, right? But do you really need all these features, right? Because like, do we need another back button? Because we've already got one in the top left. Or do we need this sign in and register link? Because you can access that under the menu in the top right, and it's not core to it. And is anybody really going to complete this survey, right? At this stage in the interview, let's take that out. And is anybody going to share this on social media, really? Or the language. Like, we already presented a language option on the first screen. Why would we need to switch languages halfway through an interview? Or the edit answers. You can just click the back button to edit an answer. Or maybe it would be better to present that at the end. And the left-hand nav, do we need that? It really makes it look busy, and we've got a progress bar already across the top. And the listen, are we sure people are going to listen to this? If they need to listen, won't they be using their screen reader technology or something else like that? So if we eliminate all these options in Docassemble, we go from a screen that looks like this to this. And I don't know about you, but this just makes me go, right? I look at this and I'm like, holy smokes, what's going on here? And look at this and, it's relaxing, right? The point is, don't turn on a feature just because it's there, right? Have a really good reason to use it, and if you need extra evidence for using a feature, do some user testing. And the last things I wanted to share was 4 principles for good graphic design. I learned these before I was ever a web designer, back in the 90s when I was doing graphic design, and they are repetition, alignment, proximity, and contrast. And if you just use these words when you're looking at any design problem, good design repeats things, they're aligned, it uses proximity, and it uses contrast. Let me show you. Here is that interview when we use any which font, any size, we mix and match outlines, right? So repetition, I mean, the most logical thing is use the same font throughout, use the same font size throughout, unless you have a reason not to, right? And graphic elements too can be repeated. But so if we just by using repetition, we go from that to this. Okay, that's a little calmer, right? Now next is alignment. This is aligned center, but center alignment is often not a good choice because it has your eye kind of going all over the place. But watch what happens if we just align it left. Right? Goes from this to this. We've got a strong left alignment point. It's easier on the eye. Now, next is proximity. Look at the input field at the bottom. We need to make that a unit, right? So we just cluster that together. We go from this to this, right? And see how it's starting to take shape? And last is contrast, right? Decide where you need contrast. So we want to call out our heading and the field label, right? So there's some contrast. Or we want to show some links. There is some contrast. Let's punch up the heading size a little bit, right? There's a little bit more contrast. Or the required field, right? That should be treated a little bit differently. Maybe we make it red and small, a little bit of contrast. Let's turn the button blue, boom, like so, right? And let's set off the header bar a little bit with a little bit of contrast. And all we've done there is we've paid attention to these 4 principles. You need contrast, you need a strong alignment point, you need to use proximity, like grouping like things, and repetition, right? You don't pick 10 different colors, you pick 1 or 2 colors and use them consistently. And by following those principles, you will have much nicer looking interviews in DocAssemble. And that is my presentation. I would love to answer any questions if you have them. Otherwise, maybe we got 2.5 extra minutes.
Awesome. Thank you so much. Do we have any questions or rebuttals from the audience? Bryce asks, let's see. Emily asks, before you started customizing, what was the content in the SAS? Was it just there automatically?
In the example Bootstrap, it looks like this. So yeah, it has a bunch of default stuff.
And you got that from Bootstrap?
That's straight from Bootstrap's GitHub repo, yes. What we do find, one thing that I did prior is I took away I uncommented some of these rows because Docassemble actually uses a lot of these. For example, the nav bar, right? So I just needed to uncomment that, and I did do that outside the demonstration.
Another question from Bryce. What advice would you have on learning about and discovering Bootstrap SAS variables that you end up changing, and when to use Bootstrap features or when to roll your own?
Yeah, good question. I didn't admit during the interview that I'm barely holding on to what I'm doing here. I'm more the business guy, and I do the UI design. But we have developers that get into this stuff. So we are running at the limit of my knowledge here. So I know enough to go through this demo, but you need more of a web developer designer to get into modifying the SAS. If I had to do it all myself, I'd just be spending hours in the documentation, the Bootstrap site. So yeah, it is good to have a web developer that understands this stuff a little bit better than I do.
Any questions from the room? All right. Well, thank you so much. This has been awesome.
Awesome. Thanks, everybody.
All right. We're going to switch over to the podium presentation mode. Hang on a sec. Okay, and just a housekeeping item. We're going to have a presentation called Ask the Experts, where you could ask Quinten and myself and some others any question you want. But the Docassemble showcase ran a little bit over time, so we're going to do that at 1. So we'll have some time. Lunch will come, for those in the room, lunch will come at 12:30, and then we can convene to have the Q&A informally at 1 o'clock. All right, so the next presentation is mine, which is an introduction to the cloud. A lot of you who are using Docassemble are not Python experts to begin with, and you're certainly not infrastructure experts, although you kind of have to climb that learning curve just to install and deploy Docassemble. But a lot of you install Docassemble on maybe your laptop or a virtual machine in the cloud, and you might not be familiar with all of the ways that that cloud systems can do things for you. So I'm going to give you a sort of broad strokes introduction to what happens when you deploy stuff in the cloud. So there's this debate between the on-premises people and the cloud people. And the on-premises people say, the cloud is just somebody else's computer. And then the cloud folks are really offended by that. And they say, no. The cloud is this abstraction where you run code and you don't have to think about how it's running and it works automatically, blah, blah, blah. But my perspective is that yes, it is right that the cloud is really just somebody else's computer. And you can sort of tell that if you use Amazon Web Services and you try to start up an instance of something. It asks you what instance type you want to use. And this one is called the T3 family. Well, you can look up what T3 means. And it says, this uses Intel Xeon Platinum 8000 series processors. So this is very much a computer. And sure enough, this is what the processor looks like that you're using. There really is no mystique about it. A computer is a computer, and there are certain things that you need to worry about when you're using a computer. First is your computer's processor fast enough, or do you have enough of them for all the things that you want to do before it starts acting slow? Do you have enough memory? Are you using so many simultaneous applications that you're going to run out of it? Or are you using so much data you're going to run out of it? And then another thing you have to worry about is, am I going to run out of hard drive space? And what catastrophic thing would happen if I were to run out of hard drive space? So it would be nice to just have more of these things, but unfortunately, it costs more money to have more of these things. And when you use the cloud, just as when you use a computer, you have to balance money against the risk of harm happening due to running out of resources. One of the things that the cloud does is it uses virtualization. It virtualizes computers for you, and then it also containerizes computers. And we heard about that before. AWS uses this software called Nitro, but there are other softwares that do virtualization, like Microsoft's Hyper-V, which you can run. And I use Docker to containerize my application, sort of bundle it up with the operating system. But there are other container products as well. Virtualization it was covered by Bryce a little bit earlier, but if you wanted to run a Nintendo Entertainment System, you could actually virtualize your NES on a website and play Super Mario Brothers. And similarly, if you're using a Windows machine, you can run Hyper-V to virtualize. And this is a virtual machine running a flavor of Linux called Debian, and you can see its fancy desktop background there and the GNOME window manager. And then inside of that virtual machine, I'm running Docker, and I'm starting an instance of the Ubuntu operating system. So I've got a computer within a computer within a computer. You might think that's kind of confusing, but this is how the cloud operates. So the AWS or any of the other cloud providers, they have physical machines in their data centers, and then they have virtual machines running on those different machines that are totally separate from one another. And then if you use container software, you've got multiple containers within those virtual machines, and you can use software to have them talk to each other. And if you're running Docassemble, you have that running in one of the containers that the virtual machine can operate. Another thing that the cloud can do is cluster computing. Like if you have a really popular website and it would crash a single computer, you can have multiple computers responding to requests from users on the web, and they can automatically be created. Like if your site suddenly goes viral, you can have more than one computer spin up automatically in the middle of the night. You can also put your computers into different availability zones and regions so that if something bad were to happen in Virginia, you can run your website out of Oregon. Another thing that the cloud can do that's helpful is provide managed services. Services are things that have been running on separate computers for a while. Like here's a photo from the 1990s of a file server on one computer, an application server on another. Maybe this is plugged into the library card catalog, and there are various computers around the building accessing that application server. And then you can have a database server running SQL. And the application server talks to the SQL server, it talks to the file server. And then there's somebody who sits in this chair who manages everything, who does the software upgrades, the hardware upgrades, and makes sure that everything's running smoothly. Well, the cloud does all this in a very similar way, except instead of a human manager, it's managed by automation and just by stuff going on in the cloud data center. Like they are the ones upgrading the servers for you. Now, Docassemble, when you install it, it's just a container and it's pretty self-contained. It has all of the services that it needs built into the container. And those services include a SQL database, a Redis database, and Redis is a very fast database that's for stuff that's like in the memory of the computer, for things like keeping track of session information. There's also a service called RabbitMQ that coordinates background tasks. But for the most part, your container is running Python code and responding to requests on the web. You can split out all of those services onto other computers. And you might want to do that for safety, for scalability. So you can have the SQL database hosted externally, the Redis database hosted externally, and you can also store files. Instead of storing files on the container itself, which is not a best practice in container coding, you can store that in a cloud-based file system called Amazon S3. And you will actually need to do all of this stuff if you are running Docassemble in a scaled fashion where you have more than one container responding to web requests. So if you have a site that, if you're lucky, it gets really, really, really popular, one computer won't be able to handle it. You can have multiple Docassemble containers responding to requests, and then it will need to talk to a central Redis server, a central SQL server. So some of the web services that Amazon Web Services can provide are computers, the obvious thing. It can also handle your domain names for you. It can do email sending, and it can do those three different types of data storage that I talked about. Now, when you use Amazon Web Services or any of the other cloud providers, you might see, oh, look, they have this feature that runs containers. Like maybe I can use that feature to run Docassemble. Well, these features are really designed for high scale, high availability deployments. And so they're really complicated. I don't recommend using them. Although if you want to, you can use the Docassemble Helm chart, which runs on the Kubernetes versions of these things. So when you're deploying Docassemble on a computer, on a single server, you can use Amazon EC2, which is their main offering for virtual machines. And I would recommend using a virtual machine with 4 gigabytes of RAM, 2 CPUs, and about 40 gigabytes of hard drive space. And that'll cost you about $33 a month. There's also a budget option from Amazon called Light Sale, where you can get something even better for $20 a month. Although it does seem like they cut some corners on Light Sale. So you might have better luck with EC2. When you choose which processor that virtual machine runs, you have a choice between the x86 Intel AMD family and then the newer ARM processors that all you Mac users run on your laptops. It's generally better, I think, as Michael said, to use the x86 family because there's better compatibility with some of the dependencies. You can use ARM if you want. You just need to build your own Docker image because the one on Docker Hub is for x86. And then when you create a virtual machine, you need to open up ports. Amazon uses the term a security group to describe like who can access which ports of the computer. So you want to open up SSH for being able to get in to do debugging, and then the web ports 80 and 443. So everybody needs a domain name. You can try to run your server on an IP address, but you can't really use HTTPS if you do that. So I really recommend everybody get your own domain name. It just makes everything easier. You can do that within Route 53, which is AWS's offering. And so the idea of the domain name system is that when somebody goes to legalhelpchat.org in their web browser, it looks up that name in a directory called DNS, and then it gets an IP address for what computer is serving up legalhelpchat.org, and that will lead to your virtual machine. So you can go on to Route 53 and shop for a domain, and then you can control its DNS entries. So this is one that I own, Litigation Database. If you just go to litigationdatabase.org, it goes to this computer. If you go to da.litigationdatabase.org, it goes to this other computer. So if you have a site, you might want to have a landing page running on WordPress at the main link, and then maybe you want your Docassemble server to be on a subdomain, da.litigation. So that's a good way to do it. Now, keep in mind that buying domain names and hosting the DNS are actually separate things. So you can go to one company to purchase your domain name, and then you can have another company host your DNS records. You can assign, if you already bought a domain name, you can assign the name servers over to Amazon. You can also use Cloudflare, which I recommend. It's pretty good. For actually sending emails, because there's so much spam, you have to go through a service to send emails. Amazon offers one called Simple Email Service, but it sucks, so don't use it. I would recommend Twilio SendGrid. And the way that you authenticate and prove that you are not a spammer is by signing up with SendGrid and doing authenticate your domain. And then it'll give you some instructions on updating your DNS, which I just mentioned. So it says, all right, create this CNAME where the host is EM9575 and the value is this garbage. None of these things really mean anything. They're just sort of codes that prove that you own the domain. So you can go to Amazon and set up those CNAME records. And then if you want to use SendGrid, you need to create an API key so that Docassemble knows what API key to use. And you just plug that into your configuration and get going. The SQL database is one that I would recommend that you explore if you have a site and you really care about about keeping the user data that you have. Because if you're keeping all of the application data within the container, that means that if your container were to blow up, your data might blow up. Whereas if you kept your SQL database externally, for example, the Amazon Relational Database Service, then Amazon would be responsible for keeping it safe. They would keep snapshots of it. It would always be on, and you wouldn't need to worry about your container going down. Or if you needed to upgrade your container, would your SQL database upgrade along with it? And so when you go to RDS, you have to pick a flavor. And all of these flavors are compatible with Docassemble, but I would suggest using Postgres. This Aurora thing sort of emulates Postgres in MySQL, and it's for like super powerful databases. I once made the mistake when I first used RDS of accepting their default instance type, and then all of a sudden it was charging $300 a month. I was like, whoa. So go for the free tier level stuff and get something moderately sized, or else you're going to pay lots of money. And then there's this really complicated thing in Amazon Web Services where your virtual machines can't talk to your database unless you very explicitly allow them to talk to one another. So choose the option for connecting to a EC2 service. And another complication is you need to make sure that your virtual machines are in the same availability zone as your RDS database, or else they can't talk to each other. I assume this is like in the same room in the data center in Virginia or something. And if you create your virtual machine after you create your database, you can click the Connect an RDS database button when you create your virtual machine. When RDS starts up, it creates this DB instance, which is a Postgres instance, and it'll create a user. And the user is for the DB instance itself. Postgres is the default name. And then it also creates one database called Postgres. And you can run Docassemble out of that database. You can also create other users or create other databases, but there's no front end in Amazon to do this. You have to go in through the command line or through a management tool. And then you just need to figure out where your RDS database is hosted, find its endpoint, which is just a web address. And when you start up your Docker instance, set up your environment variables with db host set to this thing, and then db name set to the default Postgres, and db user to the default Postgres. And it also it asks you to set up a password, and you just plug in your password. And that's all you need to do to get your Docassemble container to talk to a very high availability, reliable database. With Redis, there is a cloud system on AWS for using Redis. It's designed for like super high volume sites. So I don't highly recommend that you use it. You can use it. If you were to lose your Redis data, that's not the end of the world. There's not a lot of, there is some, if you use certain features, there's client data in there, but most people aren't using those features. So you could take a risk and just have Redis on your container. The most important thing about the cloud, and this is part of the cloud that's actually really cool and that validates the people who say the cloud is a concept, which is Amazon S3, which is just a lovely way to store files. If you go on S3, you can create a bucket, and you can give your bucket a name, and you have to pick a name that's unique across the whole world. So you have to pick something that nobody else has picked. So I picked demo docassemble.org, and then I can upload files to it. And it looks a lot like Google Drive. You can upload a picture of a cat, and you can have a folder with Word files in it. And then there's a convention for referring to files that are on S3, where instead of using http:// you use S3, and then you can refer to a particular file like a declaration of favorite fruit. Now there's the question of how do you get your Docassemble container running on some virtual machine to be able to talk to S3. And that's where I have to explain to you how AWS's identity and access management system works, which sounds really complicated. And I actually didn't understand how this worked for 5 years. And then I was like, oh, it's actually pretty well designed. It's not that bad. So when you first sign up for AWS, you create what's called a root user, which is a super user with lots of total complete power over your Amazon account. But then you can create different user groups within your account and also different users who have various privileges. So I created a group called admin, and I added a user called jpyle, and I put jpyle into the admin group. I also created a group called S3, which is a group that has full access to Amazon S3 resources. So it has no access to any other Amazon thing. So like if this user were to go rogue, it couldn't create 5,000 virtual machines and start running a Netflix server or something like that. And so here are the users. Sometimes Amazon creates automatic users for you if you use one of their services. So I've got the user S3 in the S3 group. Now I can, for any one of these users, I can create an access key and a secret access key. And that allows computer programs to use Amazon resources. You just give the computer program the access key and the secret access key. So if you were to use S3, this is one way that you could have your Docassemble instance be able to access S3 and access a bucket there. by setting the S3 bucket, the S3 access key, and then the secret access key. And for some reason, you also have to specify a region. I don't know why, but it makes it work. Now, that's one way to do it, but Amazon actually recommends that you don't use those secret access keys because they could fall into the wrong hands. If somebody hacks into the computer, they could access the secret access key and then spread it around. So it has this concept of roles, which is really cool. So you can create a role on Amazon that has full access to S3, and then you can assign that role to a computer. So if you create a virtual machine on AWS, you can give it this role that you created that has access to S3 or some other resource. And then when you're on that computer, you don't even need to provide any secret access keys at all. You just start using S3, and S3 knows that this computer is authorized to access things, and it's all like totally automatic. So if you were to set your environment variables, all you need to do is give it the name of the bucket and the region, and you're off. And so that's just sort of a brief introduction to what Amazon Web Services can do. It can do a lot of other things. It has a lot of APIs for cool stuff like text recognition and machine learning, as do Google and all the other companies. But one thing that's really cool about like infrastructure in the cloud is that you can use the command line interface for AWS called AWS CLI. And that's what I'm doing here. I installed AWS CLI on this computer, and I did AWS S3 list and all the Word files in that folder. And you can also use Python using the Bodo3 package to do anything that AWS can do. So if you wanted to provide Docassemble as a service, hint, hint, you can basically automate that totally by writing some Python code. Automate something to spin up 4 virtual machines and start and configure their DNS. All this stuff can be scripted. You don't have to go through the web interface. And there's also a tool called CloudFormation that allows you to have like a whole bundle of different cloud resources all in a recipe that you can just spin up at will. But that's all that I have. So I will, does anybody have any questions? Let's see if I can. In the room?
Yes, I have a question.
Yeah.
Why is the Docassemble logo a cat?
As you'll notice actually throughout the presentation, all good software products have a cute animal in the logo. Docker is this cute whale with containers on top. Podman has this cute little walruses. And I just really like cats. So that is my cute animal logo. All right, I can't see the chat for some reason. Oh. Okay. Well, next up we have Quinten. Oh, you did?
All right. So I want to just show you a technique that I've been using with some of my clients for doing kind of simple document automation. And the basic idea here is, everyone has some set of client interviews that you might want to face the world, and you have some set of interviews that you just want to face inside your organization. Basically, we're going to be using some techniques that build upon the software that we built at Suffolk called the document assembly line. Document assembly line, we focused on doing a lot of really fast, repeatable automation. Yesterday, we demonstrated a tool called the Weaver, which lets you come from a template to building a draft of a customizable interview where all of the questions, you can control the order, you can customize the look and feel of various questions. And that's perfect when you're building an interview that's facing the world. You want to have a lot of control over all of those details. You want to have a really thoughtfully designed system from start to finish. But sometimes when you're automating a bunch of really simple documents, like letters, maybe some of these case opening documents that you might have when you're working together with clients that are the same every time, you don't want to actually answer any questions about those in an interview in an interactive way. You need something that Docassemble has a really nice ability to progressively add the complexity that you need for those documents. So if you are using your case management system, almost all of the case management systems that exist in the world have some kind of feature for doing basic template automation. Use that in Legal Server and Clio. My case, generally you're limited to kind of this very simple fill in the blank interface though, right? Like you're able to copy your client information into the template where you want it to go. Maybe if you're really lucky, you have a little bit of room for conditional logic, but you can't build the kind of rich interface that you can do with Docassemble, where you're pulling information in from multiple APIs and creating a really nice way to save time for the person who's sitting on the other end of the interview. So we're going to talk about a workflow that allows you to get some of the power of Docassemble without having to really build that thoughtful, complex interview from the beginning. You can just add it when you need it and as you need it. So one of the things I discovered, I have this consulting side of my life where I've been working with law firms around the world. Some of them are very small law firms. Turns out something I had assumed was that most law firms, as we did in legal aid, had some kind of case management system in place. Not true. Plenty of you all out there in the world do not have any case management system. So you have various different kinds of systems. Maybe you're using something like Airtable, maybe it's a series of spreadsheets. Maybe in your line of work, you're okay with the risk associated with not having any case management system at all. But you're collecting all this information from clients that you don't want to have to keep entering again and again. So one piece of the system I'm going to show you today is how to build an intake interview in Docassemble. That's going to be the one that's facing your client. Capture the information from that intake, and then use it to create these simple documents that I'm talking about. One piece of that is building a library of questions. It's one of the most powerful features of Docassemble. You can have a library of questions that you use some or all of for each of your various interviews. You can layer them on top of each other so that maybe you override just one version of that question for how to ask a person's name. We did that. We kind of went through that yesterday with the name change interview. When you're asking for somebody's name and you know they're about to change it, you want to phrase the question a little bit differently. What's your current legal name, or what does it say in your birth certificate? You don't want to just assume that that's the name that they're going to be identified by. So Docassemble allows you to do that. And so I'm going to talk a little bit about what that question library idea is. And then finally, we'll talk about how to connect these different pieces together. All right, so here's an example of an intake interview. And let me see. I'll actually show you what this looks like. No, okay. This is a thing we've been dealing with. We should talk. This would be one of the expert questions. Some Docassemble servers seem to keep getting caught up by suffix automated security blocking software. So I won't worry about the actual demo. But assume that you've seen many of these kind of questionnaires, right? It's asking for the client's name, their address, all the basic information. And then you want to connect those answers with various things. So one output from that interview right now for this client that I had put on the screen is just a Word document, which has all the answers in it. Another output is a JSON file. And then finally, the last thing is a spreadsheet. But the most important thing of all is the fact that when we answer that intake, we're creating a row or a series of rows inside the Docassemble database, which contains all of those answers exactly as Docassemble expects to see them And those are the exact format you want when you're building another Docassemble interview that reuses those. So we don't end up having to use any of those other outputs. We don't need the Word document. We don't need the spreadsheet. We don't need the JSON file. Those are nice to have as a backup or maybe some other future use. But we can actually just directly use the information from the Docassemble into a database. So in this client journey, we're talking about moving from the client entering the information. Those intake answers are saved somewhere inside your system. I think the best place is right inside the Docassemble normal session in the database. The attorney then can reuse those fields to generate something like a client letter, some simple document that doesn't require a lot of customization in terms of the way we design our questions. And we're going to be able to set up the default interface in Docassemble is that those questions disappear. Whatever answers you give disappear after a certain amount of time. 90 days is the default in the configuration. But you can set that up so that those are persistent if this is your intake interview and you know you're going to want to reuse and revisit those again. We're going to actually be able to load that information from our intake interview and use that to populate another set of answers inside a separate interview altogether. And something that you might notice is that if we're talking mostly about this information reuse, when we talk about a question library, we're going to start with the exact questions that are inside our intake. But we don't have to be limited there. We can add a larger library of questions. And one source for those could be the Suffolk Lit Labs document assembly line, where we've built a library of many questions and also are doing that in an object-oriented way. So as long as you have something that you give the right class in Docassemble and Python, you say this is a person, for example, we have various ways to collect and then to reproduce the information about that person that we've customized. It doesn't matter whether you call that person a notary, for example, or the other party, or the petitioner, respondent, whatever it might be. Those questions are flexible enough to handle all of those as long as you say what type of object that is. And also, kind of a cool feature that Docassemble has is that you can handle new questions on the fly. So even if they're not part of your question library, you can build in a fairly flexible way to ask the user a question, to provide a response to a field in the interview without ever having designed that question, and without ever telling Docassemble directly that that is a question that might eventually get asked. So one of the nice things about working with the question library, we saw a little bit from Chris's presentation earlier, how you can load in, how you can do things like customizing the brand. Your question library could be also associated with a brand and identity for your interview. We can layer questions, as I described earlier, where a more custom version of it is used in just certain interviews without losing the ability to benefit from your big library of the questions that are used most often. And you can add something like a domain-specific question for something like the name field, just a scenario that I described as well. So here's how catch-all questions work. I'm going to start by just showing you how simple the code is, and then I'll give you some examples of some catch-all questions. Those are a key component of this kind of interview. This is an example of the logic for a catch-all question. You see here, we just have to give it this modifier. We tell Docassemble that this question type uses and defines a DA catch-all object. When Docassemble is doing its normal thing of catching undefined names, there's a few things that can happen. One is it actually finds a question that defines it that was written specifically to define that. That's kind of the normal scenario. The other thing is that your user can get an error screen and it says there's an undefined name in your interview. There's something that can't be answered by the interview. Catch-all questions kind of sit in between those two extremes of a perfectly designed question and one that's going to give an error screen. Docassemble catches that error and it says, wait a second, let's see if we can present another kind of question for the user. and we'll see if any of these catch-all questions match. This x.object name is going to just put on the screen the name that the user put inside the template file. The variable that they wrote that otherwise could be undefined is going to be shown right here on screen in the place where I put x.object name. Underneath this question that I'm showing you here is just to define a text input. A text field is what will pop up here. So you can see it's just the normal, there's no data type associated with this. So it's just going to be showing the most basic kind of Docassemble question in response to that. And then at the bottom, this is optional, but if you want to be able to work with this question in your interview without having to know that it was a catch-all kind of response, you might want to do something like this here, where you replace that special catch-all object with just the normal data type of that answer. So here we're saying this comes in as a string, it's just a text field. We're going to get rid of the catch-all object after this question has been answered and just only save a string in our database. So here's how we're actually using it inside this kind of magic interview, which connects to your intake answers and responses, and then actually uses them to fill in a template file. Here I've chosen as an example an interview where we integrated that library of templates, which don't have specifically designed bespoke interviews for, and we're storing them on box.com. And I've just put in one example template file here. Like you can see, I also gave someone the option to upload a new template. This was a really popular way of working with templates when I was at Greater Boston Legal Services. And rather than sourcing the answers from our intake interview, we were sourcing them directly from Legal Server, which was our case management system. And we get our normal kind of workflow of questions. You can see here, if I've provided some of the answers already from an intake or from another source like Legal Server or whatever your case management system is, I wouldn't get this question to pop up, but it's going to go through and ask me all the things that aren't defined yet. This one has a slight customization in it. And here is an example of one of those catch-all questions. So inside my template file, I just had put down a variable name that wasn't defined anywhere else, and I called it representation basis. The way that I've displayed the object name function actually will replace the underscores with spaces, so it gives you something that's a little bit closer to being able to understand, and it's just putting up a text box here on the screen for me. You can get a little bit fancier. So inside this question, I'm detecting, which is one of the features that catch-all objects have as well, that someone is trying to treat the response like a number, and it's a number that has a decimal point. And I've chosen to say, okay, anytime that someone has a number with a decimal point, I'm going to assume that's a currency value. And I designed the catch-all question to, in that case, show a currency input, which is going to use all the normal features of formatting that answer and the question. And let me see, you can do the same thing with keyword matches. So in our library of catch-all questions, we're looking for things like annotating the field name with underscore date. That's going to pop up a date input. You can have all kinds of rules of your choice for how to deal with patterns of questions. Even potentially, you might think, well, maybe I want to let people put in options and all of those kind of features right inside the template, so they don't ever have to write a question that says, pops up a drop-down menu, for example, with multiple choices. That's something that I think I've generally steered away from, but it is an option depending on what kind of workflow you have best. If you have a lot of untrained or lightly trained folks building templates for you, that's something you might want to consider doing, just so that you don't have to invest in the Docassemble developer time to build a question for every new kind of scenario where someone has multiple options you want them to choose from. If you want to learn a little bit more about all of these tools and features, we built an example of kind of the same workflow that I've just demonstrated here. It's inside the document assembly line projects documentation page, the QR code, and this URL will take you there. And that's worth a kind of a closer look that goes a little bit beyond this quick overview. All right. So that's, I think, one of the cool things that we can do with session and reusable session information in Docassemble. I'm going to go a little bit more detail into the way that we're implementing this on the back end now. And the key, and this is also described and documented on our document assembly line page, is this sessions.py module we built at Suffolk. So there's lots of ways to do this in Docassemble, but we kind of built an easier to use API for it, or at least an API that made sense for our use cases. So this module contains functions and conventions for working with sessions. Some of the functions, we are just using a slightly different approach to loading data from the database. The way that you would normally load session information from Docassemble is not optimized for hundreds of rows of data. And if we drop down to native SQL, we can do a little bit more optimized query. And one of the keys there is often you want to kind of filter and look through the data before you load it. You don't want to see all of the responses. You only want to see some subset of them. So in order to allow us to do those queries quickly, Docassemble for one interview might add 30 or 40 rows, maybe longer interview might have 50 rows that each represent every screen of the interview's answers. You don't want to have to load all of those answers, decrypt them, turn them back into Python objects in your interview before you can filter them. So we created a table in the database where it's just storing a simplified JSON representation of just a few key pieces of metadata that are associated with that interview. And those can be anything you like. They can be a tag, can be a zip code maybe if you want to filter them geographically. Whatever information you think is important to store as metadata, you can store in that metadata table, and then you can run your query against all of those facets. Another thing that came with our session.py module is this idea of the answer set. So we were hearing again and again from people, particularly in legal aid and in law firm settings, that they wanted to be able to reuse the data in multiple ways without having to have someone start from the beginning of the interview. If you've designed your templates and your interviews so that they use the same variable names throughout, then you can actually copy information from one interview into another, and it will actually save you quite a lot of time in responding to the questions. And we've taken that concept and we've called it an answer set. It's a way to do that kind of simple, basic data reuse. It's a feature that Docassemble didn't have a name for, but it existed. And the way we manage that is the intake interview was one place you could store and save and persist that data, but we're persisting it in a dedicated YAML file where, which is just for storing the answer sets. Something that you can also do with this is you can import and export the files to JSON. They'll preserve all the data. We've built a little replacement for the interview list page, which leverages the sessions module as well, which is a little bit speedier when you're working, again, because of the way that we're loading the metadata, things you want to know, like who used this interview and what time, without having to load all of the answers from the interview. And we built some little wrappers around Docassemble functions to let you save and load the answers associated with the session. So if you want to do more advanced things with these concepts of reusing session data, the sessions.py module might save you quite a lot of development time. I showed you that idea of integrating that database of templates with Box, but you could have your data source be something else. It could be S3, it could be a SharePoint library. Anywhere that you already are working with your templates, you could point something like this generic interview, which just loads data from another data source. You could integrate that with a tool like this. And you can also take advantage of Docassemble's digital signature features. to avoid having to do something like DocuSign and pay for those kind of licenses, those documents that you want someone to sign are almost always going to be custom, right? You're sending a document to someone that you wrote. Maybe it's an agreement that you need them to execute. If you just modify that to put a placeholder in for the signature, a tool like this can allow you to upload your template, have Docassemble build the questions that it needs for it, and those can be as complicated as sending it out for a signature. So, as I said, there's lots of times when you do want a really well customized and thought through workflow for each question in your interview. But when you don't, this can be a good solution. It's really best for those shorter documents where it doesn't matter what order the questions that are presented to the user come up, because you really can't customize the question order with this approach. Another limitation is the catch-all question concept. I showed you some of the ways it can be flexible, but it really only lets you give very simple clues to get the context out of the template and then present a question to the user that they can kind of understand. You're going to probably use this mostly with interviews that are facing inside your organization rather than facing the world. But it can add a little bit of extra safety to your interviews if you are concerned that there may be developer errors that are in a branch that's hard to discover. If you add catch-all questions as one other safety check, you can make sure your client can finish the interview, even if you forgot to write a question for something. Right. That's it. That's kind of the big overview of the concept, but if anyone has any questions, we'd be happy to answer them. Right. I think I'm competing with lunch, so I'm sure everybody wants to get started with that. I'll be around and we can keep answering more questions later.
And we'll be back at 1 o'clock in about 15 minutes for a sort of lunchtime Q&A with the experts. So you can ask us anything you want, hopefully related to cats and Docassemble. Any burning issues that you have. So start